Hi, everyone. Welcome to our special Instagram Live for World Social Justice Day. I'm Aisha, joining from 100 million US, and I'm so excited to be here with you today.
And I'm Isha, representing Child Marriage Free World. Thank you all for tuning in. We have a really impactful conversation lined up today with our amazing friend and activist, Fernanda. Fernanda is a lawyer with a specialization in public international and international human rights law. Fernanda also has a strong background in children's, women's, and Indigenous people's rights.
World Social Justice Day is an important day that emphasizes the fact that social justice isn't just an idea, it's a movement. And today we're talking about how we can take real action to protect children's rights and create a more just world. So, welcome, Fernanda, now.
Hi, Fernanda.
Hello. Thank you for the invite. It's great to be here.
Of course. Thank you for joining us again for another conversation on children's rights. Our last conversation was during Farm Workers Week, right? And
Correct,
that was
yeah.
an incredible conversation that we had. So we're excited to have you back. So to start, can you tell us a little bit about your work and what social justice means to you specifically?
Right. So social justice is something that I've been kind of like working and I've grew up with because of the way that my parents have always like educated us, and they're like very socially conscientious.
Mm.
So I grew up in Costa Rica, and you can see the differences, between inequalities everywhere. So it's kind of in your face, the types of like differences that exist within different groups of people, especially given the diversity and the different populations that are like intermingling, intermerging at all times. So social justice is something that I basically grew up with, and later on, when I was kind of in high school, thinking like, oh, what do I want to do? How do I like to spend my time? I was like, well, maybe I can do maybe international relations or do human rights. I think that would be the case. I always liked the history, especially of Latin America. I've always liked to read a lot, so that opened up a whole like world of possibilities and like different realities across the continent too. And so it's really easy to um, have like empathy and like compassion because it's a reality that's kind of shared throughout the South American countries. So we shared like that history, and we share a lot of the um, yeah, social issues that derived from history and structures, and is systematic too. So I thought that the best way to do something about it was to study and become specialized in human rights. So social justice is something that I like to think about it as if it's embedded in all the things we do
Mhm.
every single day. If you think about it, it's about education, it's about water, it's about the air we breathe, and everything has to do with rights and the way that the society um, is set up so that certain populations have more access and others are not having certain rights or access to services. So I think that that's basically what moves me and what I literally like breathe every single day, in all aspects. And that's something that I would really like to share with others and to create awareness, and also like that part of the education on what rights are, so that people take them and can um, have better quality of living and have better access. And the only way that you can do that is by democratizing, is that a word, sorry, by democratizing the rights of other people, and people like taking them and apprehend them, and then later on just live like that, which I think it's great, but you can only do that through education.
Thank you so much for sharing, Fernanda. Thank you for sharing what social justice means to you and how it's driven you into the work that you do now. I want to also ask you about, so you're currently the president and director of Media Voices for Children. Can you tell us a little bit more about the organization and what your role entails?
Yeah, thank you. It's been great to transition into that, to being the director and the president. It's been something that, um, I moved to the island of Martha's Vineyard and to Massachusetts, with that like legal background and like human rights in mind. But the island is not like although it has a bunch of different not for profits, it's a super hub for those types of like work. I don't think specifically on the right space is not like very broad. So when I saw Media Voices for Children, for me was like, wow, there's something there that I can actually do and that I know and that I've had experience on. So I got really excited, and basically I started as a volunteer. I reached out, and it's been so cool to learn the organization from the bottom and up. So it was great to be working with Len Morris, who's been a great figure for me, and I know that for a lot of people in the child labor coalition. He has been working on this organization for over 30 years. He was Iqbal Masih, US DOL awarded person for his work on child labor, and the dedication that he's put into that. So I think it's been great to be learning with this great figure, and to take over the organization that he's created, because he teach me like really well, and so now we're kind of like transitioning. We still do have some projects on Kenya with the Kenyan schoolhouse, and so we have over 40 kids getting education. They've been rescued from child labor, and that has been the main goal, to keep them in school and to transition, and to even though we've been in contact for a long time, just to be in contact with our partners in Kenya, and figuring out ways that we can move forward in the US, especially with the situation, the political climate right now. So we're like creating different approaches to the different types of work, because part of my background has been also working with immigrant children and immigrant populations and refugees. So I think it's incredibly important to keep the work that we've been doing, especially now, on advocacy and education and empowerment, because most of the kids that work in the agricultural fields right now are undocumented children, and the children of migrants, and especially coming from Latin America. And a lot of them have these indigenous roots. Not all of them are speaking Spanish. So they're like kind of speaking different indigenous languages. And I think there is a great um, setup of organizations working in the baseline, but there's for this type of work, it's never enough. So as much as we can do, as much as we can advocate for these very vulnerable populations right now, I think that's something that I'm incredibly interested on keep on working. So we're working on developing protocols and tools to support these populations right now. So that's been basically the line that we're keeping, and continue to be involved with the Child Labor Coalition and the work that it's been done from Washington and all the other organizations that are doing a wonderful and amazing job.
Yeah, and just for the people watching, I just want them to be able to know that you can check out the Media Voices for Children website. I've been on the website multiple times. You guys have amazing resources, and movies and documentaries that you produce are extremely enlightening. So I do recommend everyone to go check out their website. And Fernanda, you clearly have immense experience working with children and working on children's rights specifically. So recently, we actually concluded our first Child Marriage Free World Pledging Week, Global Pledging Week, where we focused on the injustices that many children, majority of them being girls, face when they're married off at an early age. So research has shown that child marriage has actually been increasing for poorer girls in Latin America. So what do you think are the underlying factors that are driving this trend in the region?
Right. Well, after the pandemic, we've seen an incredibly big and like a steep increase in inequality and poverty due to all the economical kind of like backlash deriving from
Mhm.
the pandemic. So that has been a very big hit, especially in places like Latin America, where there's a lot of instability and political instability. So I think it's a combination of the situation that was happening before, and it was like getting better for some time, but apparently now by 2030 is going to be increasing, which is also a consequence of all of these cuts in the social investments, I would say, due to the general economic problematic. But there's a lot of like gender inequality, a lot of economical hardship, and there's a lot of extreme poverty. And so people or families, mostly the families, because it's always driven mostly by adults, right? It has to do with bringing the girls into unions, because not all the time is like the marriage as in the legal way, or as in the mostly Catholic way, which is like the main religion in Latin America. So there's a lot of like free unions or like cohabits that have to do with setting up the girls, or this idea that the girls would be better off if they're married to an older person that can provide for them, or that would provide for the economical stability that the parents can't provide. So this is bringing a lot of other issues that have to do with educational barriers, for example, because now that you've turned into a bride, you're mostly into domestic work, or even though your body is not ready, you may be even becoming a mother. And that brings a whole different set of obligations and distractions from the main part, which would be, getting an education and being set up for better quality of living. But unfortunately, when people face extreme poverty, is incredibly difficult to like think of something different, as this has been the way, and it's been proven. This has been very broadly studied, that poverty is intergenerational. So that's why social programs end up being so incredibly important, because if you don't have the support from your immediate family, and then that's kind of like the surrounding situation of your life, like if there are no organizations or a state that's providing for the basic human rights, basically, and providing for those needs through social programming, then there's going to be no way that people can get out of poverty. So I think there is a big responsibility from the states all across Latin America, and communities that have been uh, cutting and cutting the social programming. So this brings into educational barriers, the also the gender norms that are set up in place, in the tradition too, because in a lot of rural areas, this is what's going on. It's kind of like the tradition that you get married in certain areas, especially of those of in rural and indigenous cultures. The way that being a child is perceived is culturally completely different than what the Westerners see, or the Spaniard descents perceive. So it is very kind of complex to work in these communities, depending on the way that the approach is being made, because you will have different types of societies that can be more patriarchal, or you can even have matriarchies, but the whole understanding is completely different. So there is a lot of that, and if we go to like the more like westernized or like Spaniard descendant way, there is a lot of the Catholic values that are placing marriage and the idea of womanhood towards the end goal, getting married and making a family. So
Mm.
those ways of perceiving the world, and the education and the values of the whole of society, independently even of religion, it's really culturally embedded, have a lot to do with being like the most desirable practice. So if you combine that culture with economical strain and necessity, you'll get like a very amplified
Mhm.
um, and normalized uh, way of perceiving the child marriage, right? So it just gets like broadly normalized, and that also like triggers violence and abuse, and these girls get trapped into like economical dependence again, because they definitely need to rely on their partners and in their partners, if you can call that a partnership. And as the girls grow, there's a lot of control over like female sexuality, and the way that this happens is like parents tend to like think, well, this is she's growing up, we don't want her to get pregnant, but there's also a lack of reproductive care and sexual education. So they kind of like restrain and control the body autonomy of girls in a way. So there's a lot of like combinations, and I think um, in a general sense, I would say there are also like weak legal protections, policy gaps, but mostly economical and cultural factors.
Thank you so much for sharing. That was a really great answer to like what you think are the underlying factors that are driving child marriage in the region. You mentioned instability, poverty, um, cultural practices, and I think that those are all really important. You also talked about pregnancy and lack of access to reproductive health, which we know is a driver as well. Um, I think it's also really important you mentioned that part of it is these are a lot of times informal unions, and not legal marriages, and that there are gaps within the legal system. So I want to transition this question because Colombia recently, on November 13th, 2024, banned child marriage, both legal child marriages and informal de facto unions for anyone under 18 without exceptions. This like reform closes legal loopholes that enable harmful practices, and ensures stronger protections for girls and adolescents. Can you talk to us a little bit about what led Colombia to ban child marriage?
Right. Well, Colombia has been going through a big political kind of like uplift from from the perspective of human rights recently. They've been signing a lot of the peace accords. The violence has been kind of under control in certain areas. So that has been allowing Colombians to be able to focus on other topics other than the civil wars going on there for years and years. It's been like the longest one, I would say, in the region. So I think that this has to do a lot with the advocacy and the incredible amount of pressure and help, I would say more help from the international and regional human rights, you know, dispositions. We have the Convention on Belém do Pará, that's specifically, and that goes with the Organization of American States. So we use that as a big tool in Latin America to promote the rights of girls and women. And there's also been a couple of interventions or reports done and follow-ups with the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child, because they follow up. They have like these set up procedures where you can create like a denounce, and then they do a whole checkup on the situation on the country, and then they kind of like bring it down and narrow it down to the case in specific that's being promoted. So I think that is incredibly useful tool to start moving and to keep um, up with the expert criteria on these topics. So they were also urging for legal reforms on top of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. So I think that that is a great way of receiving like that type of input and to be part of like the bigger international system, but then bringing it down into the national legislation is the most important part, because that's like the reason why countries are signing up all of these agreements and conventions. So some of them are like legally binding, some of them are not. They're like kind of recommendations, so they're considered as like soft law. But I think that when an international organization has a saying and it's like a such high quality of professionals, you know that you're getting like the best um, policy advice that you will ever get. So people do tend to keep that in mind, and governments actually do pay a lot of attention to them. So that's one part. Then, you know, there's a lot of evidence coming from the harm that the civil society and organizations have been um, warning about the physical, the profound physical and psychological, economical consequences on child marriage, and how this affects women, and how that even contributes to um, less kind of like economical development, because women are not kind of contributing to society economically in the way that it should be, as if it was, you know, kind of in the same way that if they were given the same opportunities that boys have. So there is a lot of economical parts in there. Then there's the child's rights and advocacy movements have been going at it for a long time. For a long time, they presented these over 9 times. So it wasn't passing. It wasn't the
Mm.
right time. So here's a very interesting way that I think it's also part of the cultural um, system that we were speaking of before. Because recently, and this is so funny, um, the reggaeton artist where, you know, the Medellin has been turned into this capital for reggaeton, and a lot of people have been coming into Colombia and enjoying the culture and all of this. So there was a song that was released by all the big reggaeton artists, which are like Colombians, and they were making a whole you know, like sexualizing basically uh, a 14-year-old girl. So this was huge on the social media, and people started reacting. And the reaction from the main artists was really negative, and like they were not taking accountability, they were not taking responsibility, and kind of like downplaying it. But there's these other women, like the female artist with her name's Carol G, and she was kind of tracing back and saying like, I'm sorry, this is horrible, I still have a lot to think about and to learn. So this debate about sexualizing minors um,
Mm.
brought up a lot of power into the movement of like, hey, what are we doing with our girls? How are we treating our girls? What are we doing as society? How is this so normalized?
Mm.
And so the president started pushing for the reform, given the pressure from the public and the feminist movements and the child protections movements and the academy for artists and all of these. So this is incredibly powerful because even though it was something really shady and kind of dark, how it was being presented and the way that it was like normalized, the good part is that people actually started speaking about this. And this is part of the cultural factor that I've been mentioning, because once a certain topic comes into the mainstream, then it's really easy to change and educate and advocate for um, the policy changes that need to be happening. But if you don't have a reference and it's not taken to the heart in a massive way from the public, it's really hard that the politicians are going to feel the pressure to make the changes that need to be happening. So I would say that that situation gave a lot of like momentum. And finally, the president Petro was kind of like forced to sign it after the Congress by unanimity. How do you say that when everybody says yes and they're good?
Mm. Yeah.
um, they said, yeah, okay, let's do this, and then he just like signed it, and it was all good. So it's really interesting to see how the power of culture and the culture shifts through like pop culture have a huge impact on what we can do through policy. So
Yeah.
it's really interesting. And another thing is that since there's like this boom and like kind of like the Latin American countries trend and the music in the Spanish and that we're seeing in the US, especially, that's been like more adapted into the popular culture. We've seen this other show. I don't know if you saw it on Netflix. It's this show about 100 Years of Solitude, which is like one of the biggest literature pieces in Latin America. Every single Latino, I would say, have had like forcibly or non-forcibly read that because it's kind of like the school curricular. Um, so they were the part of this is a story about the creation of Colombia, and it's like magical realism. It's related to history, but also magically because of the indigenous roots and the cosmovision that intertwines in between our cultures. So one of the things are that are presented there is a child marriage. Um, and I think that it's very, very, it's a great production. It's a great, artistically played off really well, and and as it has like such power in the consciousness of Latin Americans. But when you see it in the show and the way that she's been like groomed basically by this older man that seems to be interested in her, then he ends up being married to her, then she ends up being pregnant, and at the end of the day, since her body is not ready for that, like she ends up passing out, dying, sorry. So you see it in a presented in a series of um of chapters and in the show. But again, this has to do with Colombia.
Mm.
So I think that since it's been something so big and so many people saw it, and I think it's kind of like a reflection, it reflects back on you in the way that certain things have been normalized, and in the way that these laws are incredibly old. This law, for example, was from 1888. So you can see how many years have passed since that law was enacted. And so those laws keep the culture, because you cannot make any changes if the culture is not like taking the change, or if the culture is kind of like not ready for it, because then you'll face a lot of opposition. So I think it's like really interesting to see how these um, pop culture icons are being like set up, and how it helps to move forward the work that advocates and lawyers and civil society has been doing for the longest time. But again, that's another example of how it like brings a lot of power, but there's still a lot of things in work to do, because that, let alone like just passing the law, doesn't mean that there aren't like any loopholes. And as you were mentioning, Aisha, the you cannot do it legally, but that doesn't mean that in certain areas that wouldn't happen de facto, as a matter of fact. So it's gotta be civil society has to be informed. It's gotta be involved. The awareness and the advocacy and the educational part of the consequences had to be have to be promoted still, and especially in the rural areas, um, because there are like many ways. Sometimes, the country is incredibly vast, and there are places where the state doesn't have like an effective control over the citizens, and the state maybe doesn't have the capability to act accordingly. So this is when civil society needs to step in and create this sort of like child marriage, child labor, and like kind of like child friendly zones, because you can't just take all of that responsibility and put it into a state that's incredibly limited in resources, in knowledge. So there's a lot of work that still needs to be done.
Yeah, thank you. That was, I think you gave a great comprehensive explanation of how it all led to Colombia essentially passing that law, right? And I love how you took it from how the international community played a role in helping the Colombia government pass that legislation, but you also talked about how civil organizations and national organizations played a role. And then we also talked about how individuals, right? The power of social media, what you just said, in today's day and age is very important. And social justice could be accomplished through social media now, with people's voices. And just, I love how you brought the communal aspect to it, which I think, goes to show that you can't do everything alone. There's power in numbers and mobilization. So thank you for sharing that. And I think you kind of answered the question that I'm about to ask you, but maybe just reiterate and kind of re-emphasize what you did mention. How can the success of Colombia's recent reforms inspire change in other countries within the region?
I think that is a very, very interesting question. Some countries have set up the, legislation, including Peru, Colombia, República Dominicana, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Mexico, Ecuador, Costa Rica, Panama, Paraguay, Uruguay, and Chile. So there's a lot of countries that have prohibited child marriage already. But then again, this doesn't immediately translate into the actual, I mean, like prohibition makes it like harder, but the free unions can still happen. But when there's a law, it's easier for people to go over and change it, right? But I think that there's still a lot of work to do. For example, in Nicaragua and Haiti and in the Caribbean islands, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. And the more that these policies and these big news come out, I think that it also puts an eye on the topic, because sometimes when the press is not speaking of a certain topic, then it's almost as if the work that the organizations have been doing and civil society are kind of like silenced, or are like more underground. So I think that this can be very positive for the region to keep on pushing for more reforms and to expand the government presence and resources in certain places, and to, you know, bring the topic more into the conversation, because this topic hasn't been spoken in a long time. Most countries don't have like that cultural impact, or because they don't have like these cultural hubs as a matter of like pop culture, you know. So I think it can be different when a country that has like it's exporting a lot of the pop culture in the region does something so big, and then it's reflected also on the way that things are normalized or not. So I think it has a lot of the potential, and people can see this as a positive way in of moving forward with this topic. But um, I'm thinking that we still have to do a lot of the pressure in other countries, because, you know, Colombia is a pretty big country and it has a lot of influence, but there's a lot of different countries that have their own like set of problems, and their whole set of you know, struggles. So even though we share a big cultural background and historical background, each country is still like on their own in terms of like policy making and advances, and what their government especially chooses to promote or not. So I think it's like a yes and a no kind of thing, but it's a great opportunity to bring in the topic into the
Mhm.
conversation. And the more that we speak of, and the more that we amplify this change in other regions on the world, I think the more impact it can have. So uh, I say like we have to keep that in mind, but also there's a lot of opportunity to amplify and be an inspiration in certain ways. So definitely, um,
Thank you. That was a really great answer, and it was a really comprehensive answer. You know, I think you talked about how a lot of countries have legislation. A lot of countries in the region do have legislation banning child marriage, but there are still loopholes, and there's still more work to be done, especially, you know, when we talk about informal and de facto unions. So I want to ask you a little bit about, you know, what challenges exist in enforcing child marriage bans in more rural or more remote areas, when we know, um, you know, this, it may happen a little bit more in these areas.
yeah, I think it has to do with the cultural part of it,
Mm.
and maybe the lack of awareness and cultural resistance. As we were speaking earlier, child marriage is something that's kind of transgenerational. So the educational baseline, most of the girls don't even have a formal education, right? So unfortunately, there's a lot of lack of literacy, and this also promotes this type of this lack of awareness on the situation. So many communities are not even aware of what's the center of the country, or the power center of the country doing, because the policies don't reach those areas. Um, so it's kind of like a combination, then again, about the actively and the lack of presence and the lack of attention and services
Mm.
makes it even more difficult for them to accept like outer norms,
Mhm.
because there's a lot of places where yeah, the local governments have a better understanding on what's going on. And as I was kind of implying earlier, there is international laws at a certain level, and there's also the way that the state on a secondary level takes them as in a federal uh, meaning, in a federal way. And then there's the other way, that's the local. And because of the way that um, the political system works, it has to do a lot with municipalities and towns autonomy. So breaking that secondary level of, yes, we are complying as a nation with the prohibition of child labor, doesn't immediately mean that the interstate um, legislation and the policy making, which is even as important, that translates those laws into action, um, and they get funded to be implemented. That doesn't mean that it's immediately like translated. So I think that's the way to keep an eye on how things are working, has to do with this. And then if we go to more localized governments in rural areas, that can be a really big challenge. Um, and that's when I think, then again, like, civil society has to apprehend apprehend that knowledge, and the work of advocacy and the work of education has to be coming like really strongly, I would say. As I said, like, they usually actively resist government intervention in many ways. So the economic pressures and survival strategies can be another hot topic here, because as it's intergenerational, maybe they're even escaping violence, that they're like living in their own homes. So they just see it. I'm gonna escape, and then I'm gonna go away with this person, and then I'm gonna become safe. And again, it's a survival tactic, but
Mhm.
it ends up being tricky, because most of the time they end up like caught in the same cycle of violence. So in other places, if it's too rural, it can be very difficult to verify the ages on child certificates. In a lot of places, this is, not as as easy. There's a lot of um, communities that live like deep in the mountains, and you can be, walking days and days and days without seeing like a town, like a structured town in a certain way. So, there's a lot of ways to kind of like go around it, including like falsifying like the birth records, or just getting a like a person to say, yeah, I'm of age, and then maybe not, right? So that can be like a combined um, thing. And there's a lot of fear for girls to, oppose their families because of the cultural part. So if these girls have been in like violent environments and domestic abuse situations, and they may fear to oppose. So there's a lot of family pressure, and especially when you think about the dependency in all ways, and the fears of retaliation because of the social norms that are happening, and the community pardon, um, backlash, that's the word, sorry. So that can be something that can make it really risky for people, because for example, if you're in Colombia and you live in a rural town, that may signify that there are armed groups around you. either from the government, either related to organized crime, either from, there's like so many different armed groups going around there that sometimes reporting can be extremely, extremely dangerous. And it's been very studied and reported by different organizations how children are being like used as soldiers, and how the girls are being used in the armed conflict as like brides or wives. And it can be tricky, right, in the way that the society has been affected by
Mhm.
the illicit traffic of drugs and the consumption in the global north. It is such a deep, deep um, intertwining of different situations and different intersections on so many different topics, but at the end everything is interrelated. So I think that if I'm in Costa Rica, for example, Costa Rica doesn't even have an army. I can, maybe if I'm careful, I can go and denounce a person, and I could say like, hey, that's an inappropriate relationship. Well, that's a child that should be in school. There's also a stronger institutional protections for these, and the institutions are like set up so that a place so that if I place denounce, I can even do it anonymously, and I know that I'll be safe. But in places like Colombia, that could or could not be the case. So the way that you have to like do these type of interventions in certain places, you have to work with the community, and you have to keep into account the orders that are in place there, even though they're not regular or coming from the state. There are like cultures there, like subcultures and powers that are like, intermingling and having a lot of say in what happens and what's not happening. So I think that can be, something that can be worked on. I don't think that you can work with these communities because, of course, if you understand that, if you're respectful, there are always ways to work with communities and to do interventions, um, and to promote these cultural changes. But yeah, addressing poverty has to do a lot, again, with the policy making, and into like narrowing the loopholes that can be happening from the legal part. So then again, there is a lot of ways that we can empower girls, and we want all the girls to be safe. We want them to be in full autonomy to decide over their futures, and of course, there's gotta be deep, deep collaboration in between government, civil society, and the local communities. I think even including the private and the public sector, including the economic part, can be very, very useful to include the all the allied forces of society into these advocacy.
I think you brought up excellent points, and all of them tie back to what we believe social justice is, as the MFW and as 100 million. We believe, social justice can only be achieved through an intersectional lens, which is kind of what you talked about, right? There's so many different layers. And I can't think of a better guest to have had on for World Social Justice Day, because I think you touched on everything that we need to achieve in order to achieve social justice, right? So, Fernanda, thank you so, so much for taking the time to chat with us today. Is there anything else that you would like our audience to know before we log off?
Well, please go visit our YouTube channel. You will find it as Media Voices for Children, just like that. We'll be uploading more of our filmmaking work and sharing the stories and the progress on the kids that are on the Kenyan schoolhouse. And hopefully, we will be doing more of that and bringing more stories about the Latino community and the farm worker community too. So please go there, follow us on Facebook too, and we also have an Instagram. So yeah, thank you for having me, and it's been such a pleasure. What a wonderful conversation we had. Thank you for the insights and the opportunity to speak.
Fernanda, thank you so much for joining us on World Social Justice Day. This conversation is just the beginning, but it was a wonderful conversation. We're so happy that you were able to join us today. To the audience, if today's discussion has inspired you, make sure to check out our work too at Child Marriage Free World and at 100 Million US on Instagram. And to take the pledge by scanning our QR code or visiting the link in our bio. Or visiting childmarriagefree.world. Yeah, thank you so much for joining us today.
And also be sure to follow Media Voices for Children, like Fernanda said. They're on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and stay updated on their amazing work. Thank you all for joining, and let's keep pushing for justice, not just today, but every day.